And, okay, so exam prep strategies. First thing is to just know everything we can about ABA. The Cooper book is a great book. I encourage people to read the entire glossary. Everything in that glossary is ABA, and reading the glossary is faster than reading the book itself. Then you have chapter summaries to look at. But to start with, the biggest picture I want to point to is that as behavior analyst, board certified, etc., two of the most important things we can do is be professional in our work and be ethical. So in the top right, you're going to see the professional and ethical compliance codes for behavior analysts. This drives everything we do. If we're not being professional and ethical, then we're not doing our professional duties to the field, to our company, to our clients, etc. So that is the driving document, and there are going to be ethical questions throughout the exam embedded into the questions. Then under that, you'll see the ethics books. Most of you have the 3rd edition ethics book, John Bailey's book. He also has a book a lot of courses use on essential skills for behavior analysts. And below that is the 4th edition task list. So those are the primary resources for exam prep. Now in the middle, in the second column, you'll see ethical issues. So I listed a number of ethical issues. I'm not going to run through them now, but anybody that wants these posters can email me and I'll send you these pictures that I've taken of the posters. The main point is you should know everything about ethics. You know certainly the client right to treatment, the 6 things listed in that article. Understand informed consent, understand what it means by capacity, information, and voluntariness. And I made several bullets of a number of considerations when you're looking at ethical issues. So everything on this is fuel for the exam. What I want to hit on particularly today is behavior analysis as the science of behavior. So in order to look at this, we have to realize that we've got to know a lot about science, basics of science. We have to know about behavior. So to start with science, science is basically a philosophy that says if we understand how things work, we can make things better. And science then has these 3 levels of science: description of the phenomena, prediction of what would happen, and then we manipulate independent variables and measure dependent variables to control and demonstrate, experimentally demonstrate, that we are showing some cause effect or at least some highly correlated effects. So science means we're going to have to use evidence. We're an evidence-based field. We're natural science. And these are the 3 driving pieces of science, the 3 levels. Now, as I mentioned, natural sciences, we're going to deal specifically with things like the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and behavior. And all of those, of course, physics, chemistry, biology, all affect behavior. And of course, our focus is behavior as a natural science. You're going to need your basic philosophy, your reasonings behind the premises for using science and measurement. So that's going to point us at FK01 in the top right corner. To me, this is the driving item on the entire task list, is to understand the lawfulness of behavior, to be able to take any scenario in the exam, to take any case you're working on, look at the behavior, and look at why it's happening and figure out what are the lawful relations between that behavior and the environment. What are the MOs? What are the SDs? What's signal it? What's the S deltas? What are the SPs? How do those antecedent stimuli alter behavior? And then look at the B column. How is it defined? How is it measured? What's the measurement to get for that behavior to see if we can make improvement in it? Look at the consequences column. How do the consequences, how do those stimuli alter the function of behavior by making more or less behavior? We really got to be able to just cite time after time, why is this behavior working the way it is? What are the environmental variables affecting the behaviors? You've really got to know the lawfulness of behavior. The other premises are the FKO2, selectionism. Where does behavior come from? It comes from the phylogenetic, the species of our ancestors, our basically survival programmed genes. It comes from our ontogenic development, the individual developing with their genes from mom and dad, which comes from the species, and then from the culture in. So for us, behavior comes from our genetic makeup and our environmental interactions. The key other concepts are determinism. Remember, any ism is a philosophy. So determinism is a philosophy of science that says things happen for a reason. And we're trying to find the reason. What set the behavior off? What evoked it or what elicited it? What is the behavior? How does it happen? How do consequences affect it? Empiricism, again, a philosophy that in order to be scientific, for evidence-based, we have to be able to define and measure what's happening. This is where we get our empirical, observable measures of behavior and behavior change. Parsimony, the simplest thing the simplest explanation that defines a phenomena adequately should be used, so don't get any deeper than you have to. Stick with environment and behavior. Pragmatism is a philosophy that says it should be pragmatic, should be practical, which means your explanation, everything you're talking about, should make sense, should be practical, should make sense. Now here's the big one, it's going to be environmental versus mentalistic. Most of us grew up with a lot of psychology around us. A lot of us took psychology courses, and psychology is a dualism model that basically says the mind tells the body what to do. So it's a two-phase. The mind is the locus of control. And the difference between that and behavior analysis with our science is we don't use the mind or mentalistic terms. Frustrated, anxious, excited, happy. Those are mentalistic terms that are not about behavior. Those are basically psychological labels for emotional behaviors, and emotional behaviors are respondents, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So the idea is we're going to use environmental terms. If someone talks about their child being anxious, we won't tell the parent there is no such thing as anxiety. Anxiety is not an antecedent, a behavior, a consequence, or function. We simply know that something in the environment is making that child feel anxious, which again is setting off some respondent. So anytime we see these other terms, we don't disavow it. We just say, I have to translate that into a behavior science term. Now that sets us up for the bigger picture of behaviorism. The philosophy of behaviorism, much like science, is that if we can understand behavior, we can make things better. And the two subcategories are radical behaviorism, that it's all behavior, and methodological, that some behavior we can measure. The private behavior, we can't measure. So when you take things like getting dressed, driving in a car, going to work, reading a book, those are all learned behaviors. We can study those with the methodological approaches. The part that's hard for people to grasp about radical behaviorism is that anything you do is behavior. So thinking is a behavior, understanding, reasoning, remembering, those are behaviors. And we've pretty much grown up, learned thinking that thinking was a mental process. People say, I was thinking in my mind. And we've got to leave that behind, not use the mentalistic label of mind, because mind's not a real tangible physical thing. It's a metaphysical concept. And the concept we're going to use here have to be empirical, things we can measure. So radical behaviorism is saying private behavior, covert behavior inside the skin is still behavior that's been shaped up by the environment. The way you've learned to think, when it pays off for you, you get reinforced for thinking that way. If you think something, you try it doesn't work, you get reinforced for, you get punished for using that thinking, and you change your thinking, you change your behavior. So what we do, of course, in our field is we're basically using methodological behaviorism to define and measure the behaviors of our clients that we're targeting. And that's where we're going to get our data, our graphs, etc. Now, the biggest piece then, to put it all together, is under behaviorism, this philosophy of if we can make things better, comes these four domains. And what we have is conceptual analysis of behavior. That's what tonight is. It's talking about the concepts of behavior. We've learned from the experimental analysis of behavior that behavior in controlled environments lets us manipulate independent variables. And from that, we have discovered, they were already there, we discovered the basic principles of how behavior works, how environments evoke or elicit behavior, and how that behavior then is affected by consequences, or if it's a respondent, consequences don't affect it. Now, the next piece then after experimental analysis is applied behavior analysis, and that's going to be the focus of the next poster. Applied behavior analysis, where we simply take the principles we've learned about how behavior works and apply them to solve socially significant problems. It's not about lab research. We use those principles, but we're trying to actually solve a serious social problem to make things better for the client, improve the quality of life. That brings us down to what we do in our field. We do behavioral service delivery. Those are our treatment models. This is what we do in the communities, in the schools, in the homes. So those are the FKs 1 through 9, the basic premises. And underneath here, I've just taken and cut out the first part of the FKs 1 through 9. One of my goals on it is to show you how every task list item is covered in this, and this is where you need to be and be fluent to understand how it all fits in. So when you're analyzing questions, you're saying, is this a philosophical premise? Is it, how do I look? I see a mentalistic term, so how is it defined and measures the behavior? So with that, I want to go to the 7 dimensions. And this, to me, is the foundation for everything else I'm going to talk about. In 1968, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis was published. Up until that time, there really wasn't a good place to publish applied behavioral research because there really wasn't ABA at that time. What we had was experimental analysis of behavior, a lot of journals, a lot of research with people in hospitals. They were doing this in companies and organizations, but they weren't getting published because most journals were looking for psychological variables, and we were talking about environmental variables. So they talked to the people in the field, and 3 professors at KU, Don Baer, Mont Wolf, and Todd Risley, were asked to write an article explaining what is applied behavior analysis, which was based on experimental analysis. And they basically wrote this article, what Don Baer wrote it, and Mont Wolf and Todd Risley says, yeah, we agree. That's what they said at the conference in '93. I was there and I got to hear them. By the way, they were my professors at KU, so they weren't my advisors, but I did get to learn a lot from them. And here's what they said, and this is what I insist, this is my goal company-wide, is that everybody in the company, RBTs, ABAs, BCBAs, ABAs, everybody learns these 7 dimensions in this order, because this is the way to look at, understand, and define ABA. Anything else is not ABA. So when we say ABA is applied, it's behavioral, it's analytic, it's technological, it's conceptually systematic, it's effective, and generality. Now, one of the gentlemen in our field, his name was Israel Golddiamond, did a lot of work that contributed to understanding behavior as a science. He helped us understand behavior analysis. And he basically said it this way: when you have a behavior problem, you need a behavior program. So programs that we use are designed to change behavior. People don't come to us when everything is fine. There's one of 2 main problems, and I'm going to categorize them this way. One problem is, this is usually why we get our referrals, is there's too much behavior. I've graphed a simple little baseline with a high rate of responding. I put that in red. I put it as a red because it's too much behavior, and it's been reported it's too much tantruming, it's too much stalling, maybe it's too much kicking, biting, hitting, pinching. So that behavior is targeted for reduction. And you can see by the baseline, clearly that behavior is getting entirely too much reinforcement. If that behavior were a goal, we could say it's pretty well mastered. However, the way to deal with it is it's a problem behavior, and we know enough about behavior to realize we've got to find a way to stop reinforcing that behavior so that it gets weaker and decreases in intensity or frequency or duration, and that helps solve a problem that's happening too much. When parents ask me to get rid of a behavior, I have to explain I don't get rid of it. It's in the repertoire. It has a reinforcement history. It's been having a function. What we can do is reduce it in some way, shape, or form. The frequency, duration, the magnitude, either decrease the time between responses, something we need to do to make it better. The other problem behavior is when we don't have enough behavior, when there are missing skills. And we're very good at doing task analysis, look at the repertoire for teaching dressing behavior. We notice the number of responses. We do a stimulus, we do a task analysis of each step, and then we gradually reinforce, promote, and strengthen until we build a repertoire of getting dressed. This is common when we're addressing things like communication skills, self-help skills like getting dressed, self-dressing, toileting, feeding. We teach you to make your bed, do your homework, help out around the house. So when skills are missing, we're very good at breaking them down and getting those skills in the repertoire. When behaviors are a problem, we're very good at arranging to stop reinforcing those and replace them with some other behavior. We know behavior has a function. All behavior has a function. Any ongoing behavior is being reinforced. We know we can't just simply punish it out or reduce it. We know that behavior was there because it worked for some purpose. We've got to find a way to replace it with other behaviors that can either meet that function or take another function and replace the problem behavior. That's what we mean by behavioral. Analytic means we're analyzing, looking for the function. We typically do an ABC. We often start with a narrative analysis, and we do an ABC analysis of hypothesized function, or a functional behavior assessment, or functional behavior analysis. Behavior then has to be technological, which doesn't mean computer technology. It means it's a technology of teaching. ABA has to be conceptually systematic. Use your concept systematically. This program should be effective. If we're not being effective, we're not meeting clinical expectations. So we talk about effectiveness, we mean clinical effectiveness. So the program has to be solving the problem. And the last thing is that program needs to have generality, which means it will generalize. So to pair up these 7 dimensions, I put the second column, which is where we live, that it applies to solving socially significant problems. Okay, we're not there just to do research to see can we change it. We're trying to find out, can I make things better? Can we improve the quality of life for the client, for the parent, for the teacher, for the community? Behavioral means we're going to have to take that term and define it operationally so we can see it, define it and measure it, get an empirical measurement on it. Once we measure it, we're then going to be able to look at that and analyze the data, like these graphs, and find the function. We know all behavior is a function. We're going to see a lot of behavior. The function is attention. But basically, I see 2 main functions in behavior. One is positive reinforcement, that the person wants access to a person, place, or thing. It might be social reinforcement, might be tangible reinforcement, might be automatic reinforcement, but they want access to something. And typically, they want to be around or with a person, or they want to have their hands on an iPad or a skateboard or a computer, want to play with the toy, maybe bounce a ball, or they want to get away from something, negative reinforcement, and they want to escape or avoid a person, place, or thing. And that pretty much summarizes Positive and negative reinforcement, either you want something or you don't. You want to be with someone or you don't. So we analyze for function, and we need to do that so we can build a technological plan, which means we've got to build a treatment model to replicate the treatment so that the BI can do it, the RBT can do it, the parent can do it, the teacher can do it. If you're in group homes, then the staff have to be able to do it. And it has to be replicable so we get the same technology of behavior change with everybody working with the client. We get consistency, we use the same contingencies. So technological means build the behavior plan. Now, conceptually systematic means we know these principles of behavior, and if we want more behavior, we know we need reinforcement. If we want less behavior, we either use extinction or some form of punishment. And as I mentioned, if we just punish a behavior out, it's going to go somewhere else. Matching law says behavior will find a place to go. It's going to find a place where it can be reinforced. It's going to try to get the least amount of effort for the biggest reinforcement. So we know we've got to systematically use those principles and only reinforce behaviors we want to increase and somehow stop reinforcing behaviors we don't want to increase. Now, again, the program has to be effective. If all this treatment isn't moving behavior in the right direction, then we're not really solving the problem. So this is where being effective means the effectiveness is demonstrated by the empirical data. What do the graphs show us? We follow the data. We do evidence-based treatment. So if we see the behavior going in the wrong direction, we know we have to revise that behavior plan. We've got to find out how are we accidentally reinforcing the wrong behaviors. We've got to study the environment and look at our treatment plan. And finally, behavior needs generality, which means it needs to generalize to other behaviors, to other people, to other settings. It needs to work in the home, in the school, and in the community. So these two columns are pretty much ABA, the 7 dimensions, what it is. Now, some people have said, I like ABA some, but I don't like to collect data. And I say, well, if you're not using data for database decisions, you can't tell if you're getting better. You can't just do the I know. We need data. So I tell them, you're not using ABA, you're using what I call SLI, which is something like it. But we're here to do ABA. Other people say, well, I don't really care so much about reinforcement. I just know when he's doing the right thing, and he should do it for the right reason. And of course, we all should do it for the right reason. But if they're dropping anything else out, then I tell them you're not doing ABA. What you're doing is NEC, which is not even close. Basically, professionally, we are funded to do ABA. Anybody who's not doing that, it's fine if they have something that works. My point is, don't call it ABA, call it something else. ABA is this program, these, in every case you've got, these things apply. And as you go through the board exam, you're looking to see, was it philosophical science questions? Was it the FK 1 through 9 issues? Or how is this example of a client, of a student, of a parent, of somebody in a day program, of somebody in factory, how are these 7 dimensions being used? And you've got to use them in order to make things better, to solve socially significant problems. Now this moves us over to this third column, and hopefully you'll recognize this. These are basically the CCRs. And my goal here is to show you that when we're doing applied work to solve socially significant problems, we first have to identify the problem. That's section G. And we know when we drill into section G that G01 is going to be do a records review. What do we already know about the client? What's happened in the past? Have they had previous treatment? The second thing, G02, is look for medical and biological issues. Are there things happening that are not operants and respondents that we can work with our model? If those are biological or medical, if they're outside the realm of behavior analysis, we can't fix everything. We're good at what we do, but there's other areas. We might need a skilled speech therapist, or we may need some dietary treatment, something that's not our field. If it's biological, medical, any of those get to the other professionals and let them bring their expertise to bear. So first we identify the problem, that's G. G03, by the way, is start a preliminary assessment, and G04 is use everyday language, which we're going to do in just a minute. But first I want you to see applied means solving these problems, which means you have to identify it for the parent. Then that's G. H is measurement. Pick the measurement that you're going to use for that behavior. If the parent told you the problem, too much tantruming, too much stalling, not getting dressed, which is like stalling, or missing skills, toileting or brushing teeth, or taking a bath. We've got to decide, are we going to measure the frequency of the behavior, the duration? We're going to measure the latency from the time the parent says, make your bed, and he takes too long, so we're looking at a latency measure. Or getting dressed takes too long, it takes too much time between putting each piece of clothing on, so we're looking at IRT. Are we going to lengthen it? Are we going to shorten it? You've got to decide what's the best measure. So on those board exam questions, you're going to see about a problem, you're going to see it's a measurement issue. You've got to figure, for this example and what they're telling me and my choices, what's the best measure that's going to let me point to the data to see the problem's getting solved, the situation's getting better, he gets dressed faster. or he does more math problems. So we've got to know our measurement to know how is this example of the test problem, and plus this is what you do on your cases. The next piece, of course, is now we've got GH. This is I, and I on the CCRs is assessment. Well, we assess for the function, and of course the function means we're looking to analyze. So our assessment is going to be the ABC analysis, a functional behavior assessment, or a functional analysis assessment, and your job is to know all of these types of assessments, from descriptive, narrative descriptions, recognize anecdotes are not data, and do the assessment strategies under section GHI. And then notice again, I lines up with the third dimension. After that, now that we have identified the function and we know the behavior we're targeting so we can try to solve our problem, we have to build an intervention. And the intervention, that's what's supposed to happen. The intervention then is the replicable behavior plan. That's the technology of treatment we use to help our client. So for board questions, you're looking to see what intervention would either reduce the frequency of behavior or shape a new response. What type of procedure am I using? Am I using forward chaining, backward chaining? How do those work? And what's my intervention? And that again has to be replicable so as it can be repeated by everybody on the case, everybody around the child. And once we build the intervention, this is where now for the CCRs, the GHIJ, we're going to now jump down to the K. And the K with that is going to be this intervention needs to be implemented, managed, and supervised. So we're implementing the behavior plan. We're using the principles of behavior systematically. We're going to supervise the team, the RBT, the BI, the parent, the teacher, the grandma, whoever is involved, manage them. We're going to follow the data to make sure it's going the right way. We're going to adjust the behavior plan if the behavior is not going the right direction. And we're going to be programming for generalization so the behavior generalizes from home to school, community, from person to person, from behavior to behavior. So this intervention we have built based on the function, we had to assess to find the function, to measure, to solve the problem, and now we're implementing that plan to solve the problem. My point here is that looking at the task list section of category 2, CCRs, is all aligned with the 7 dimensions. This is why knowing these 7 dimensions in order is so critical for your client. It makes you better in the field, a better clinician, and since we're talking about board exam prep, recognizing how all of this shows up in test questions to see, here's a scenario. Is it philosophical? Is it science? Is it about the dimensions? Which of the dimensions is it? Am I looking at defining the behavior, measuring the behavior? Is this a functional assessment? Is this an experimental design to see, does the data show me? Does the data on the graph show me the obvious functional relationship that they have experimental control? Is it about treatment? Would that treatment make sense? Is it practical? Is it pragmatic? So you want to be linking all of these together. Now I mentioned that the task list GO4 says use everyday language. So all of this technical stuff and all the conceptual analysis I'm sharing is for us to master and know as behavioral scientists, but we can't go to the parent and tell them any of these terms. That's really not going to help them. I know we try to teach them some of these things, but bottom line, when I did a lot of parent in-home training, I basically went in and said, hi, I'm here to help you. I use ABA, and what I do with ABA is I want to help solve your real life problems. So I'm going to take notes, tell me what are the problems that you're having with your child. And that's what I write down. Tantruming, stalling, not dressing himself, won't do his homework. I write down the problems they're having. And I don't expect the parents then to give me duration, frequency, or IRT measures. So I take a piece of paper and a magnet. I say, we're going to put this on the refrigerator. We're going to make a column, and we'll put tantruming in this column and stalling in this column. And what I'm going to have you do when these behaviors happen is just simply take this pencil and just write the date and then tally the number of times it happens that day. Then under that, I say, now what I want you to do is just write what time it starts, if he's tantruming, what time it starts, and what time he stops. Then I'll know how long it is. Now, of course, I can use that tally to give me a frequency measure. I can use the how long a tantrum lasts to get some duration measures. And since I write down when it stops and starts, I now have my temporal locus. I know when it's happening in time, just like the how long was the temporal extent, how long it happened in time. And the frequency was how many times it happened. I counted. That gives me at least some raw data. It may not work from reports, but it lets me get the parent to start to pay attention to the target behaviors. And usually, since there's problems, they're good at paying attention to them, but they don't really have a good sense of how much. They just know it's too much. The other thing is when we're getting good behaviors to happen, I want them to realize I'm getting more and more of the target behaviors I do want. One of the keys to helping improve behavior is to look for and recognize good behavior and make sure we're reinforcing that. Now we're down to, this is GHI. I don't tell the parent about assessing for function. I say, we're going to find out why it happens. A lot of times it happens because he wants attention. So we're going to teach him appropriate ways to get attention, to say, excuse me, or to say, I need a break. And so we got to find out why it happens, so we can then come up with the intervention, the doable behavior plan. So we've got G, H, I. Here's J, the doable behavior plan, the intervention. And when I say doable, this is critical because sometimes I've had supervisors tell me, I wrote the perfect behavior plan, the parent won't do it. And of course the answer is, well, it wasn't perfect if they wouldn't do it. It has to be doable. So if I'm not solving their problem and I don't have a plan they can actually do, it's not the perfect behavior plan. It's like a diet and exercise program. What's the best one? The one you will do. So our challenge is to come up with a plan the parent can and will do. Often we have to model, coach it with our managing and supervising, show them how to do it, coach them through it. And when they start seeing some very simple procedures work, now they're hooked. Now they realize, gee, he'll do that for me. He wouldn't do it before, but he's doing it for you. He can do it for me. And that, of course, means we're basically focusing on, we know what the problem behaviors are. We know what we want to strengthen, what we want to weaken. So we're going to use a real simple approach. We're going to be sure that we are careful to only reward the behaviors we want more of, and we're going to not reward the ones we don't. I often tell parents, here's the program. When you do good things happen. So look for good behavior. When it happens, reward it. When you don't do good things, then good things don't happen. So they often think, well, if he does bad things, shouldn't I punish him? When he does good things, I'll reward him. But when he does bad things, should I punish him? My point is, no, we don't want to really do much with problem behavior because punishing doesn't teach him what to do instead. So by just, when you do good things, good thing happens. When you don't do good things, you simply don't get the reinforcers. Now, the next point, to show that it's effective, to match this up with our sixth dimension, it's effective because it works. Now, we look at the data. We're going to look at it for clinical significance, and the parent's going to know he gets stressed when I tell him. He does his homework when I tell him. We may have had to teach a teacher to only show him 2 out of 10 math problems, or maybe pick the most important concepts rather than working 10 problems that are alike. Pick the 1 or 2 or 3 that best helps the child demonstrate they understand that particular skill, and we know how to take and make behaviors into small steps, so we have some success, then gradually increase the workload. The last thing, of course, is the generalization, where any parent wants a problem solved, and they want it solved in all environments, home, school, and community. So my point here is, this is the way we talk with parents. This is the everyday language we're going to recognize and use. This is GO4, and this whole chart is all about the 7 dimensions, what these technical things are that we do behaviorally, what the CCs are, and how that applies to talking to our parents in a way that they understand it. If we get too technical, we lose them. Now, what I've done then is I've taken those 7 dimensions, and I built another chart, and this is something where I'm hoping to start to model for you some ways to consider, how do I take this mishmash of all of my behavioral stuff and organize it in a way that I can use it, first to pass the board exam, that is the academic part, but also how do I help my client get better, because that's the whole reason we're in this business. We don't get into human services for the income, we get in for the outcome, and we're very good at helping people with these things. So you'll see the foundational knowledge starts out here in this column, where we already talked about the premises for science. Then I've got, there's the applied socio-significant behaviors, there's the behavioral, operationally defined and measured, there's analytic, analyzed for function, there's technological, that details the behavior plan, the procedure to replicate it, there's conceptually systematic, based on principles and concepts of behavior, there's being effective, demonstrated by the data, and there's generality, which means we need to produce stimulus and response generalization to be effective across people, behavior, and situations. Well, you're going to find items on the task list, like stimulus generalization, response generalization. So of course we're going to have to know these terms. And what I've done is I've then taken this next column, and I've already showed you how they line up. But for the applied part, there's not a particular task list item. What we've got there are these foundational articles, and there, when I mean applied to socially significant, there is the classic 68 article called Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis, Beryl and Risley. That was 1968. In 1987, they were asked 20 years later, is that really still the essence of ABA? And they went back and visited, and they did a presentation in Chicago in 93 called Some Still Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis, basically saying, yes, this basic program, these 7 dimensions, these 7 characteristics, these 7 components of the program, they still really define our field. And then, of course, the critical part, if it's socially significant, it needs to have social validity. And this is where Mount Wolf wrote the article called Social Validity, or How Behavior Analysis is Finding Its Heart. We were criticized early in the field for being objective, cold-hearted scientists. We didn't care what the client thought. We knew how to change their behavior for the better. But we know if the client doesn't see the benefit of it, if the parent or the teacher, the community doesn't see the benefit of it, our technology is not going to go anywhere. It has to meet their judgment. Is it socially valid? Was that an appropriate, acceptable procedure? Is the client give informed consent? Does the client find that these new behaviors work better to integrate in society and have self-help skills, etc.? So these articles, to me, are critical articles to understanding what we mean by slow significant behaviors. Those are the three that I recommend. They're usually in most of your courses. Now, after that, here's the important thing I want to make about this. This second column then takes the rest of the task list for the BBAs and the FKs, and here is the behavioral part is views and measurement, and there is a section on measurement with the A1 through, I think it's 13 or 14 of those. So that means we've got to know every type of measurement and how to plot and interpret and analyze the graph to see how the behavior is moving around. We have to analyze for function. So that's section B. We're going to look at experimental design. So this is where we've got to learn everything in section B. And by the way, B1 is use the 7 dimensions of ABA. To do the technology part, now this gets a little more expansive. When we do technology, there are these components, these 4. And from the task list, we have section C, behavior change considerations. When we go to build a plan, we know that we're going to basically use reinforcement, extinction, and punishment. And what section C says is state and plan for the unwanted side effects of these principles. So we use extinction. We're often going to get an extinction burst. We've got to be prepared to keep people safe, basically keep everybody safe. We know the extinction burst can often generate some side effects, which can be emotional or tantrum or aggression. So you got to be ready for that. The side effects of punishment is people don't like it. It pairs you up as an aversive. You can be reinforced for punishing behavior because it stops it temporarily, but it comes back in the form of revenge, retaliation, sabotage. Got to learn about how to use the right amount of punishment to shut it down, but not overdo it. And same with reinforcement, to be careful we're not reinforcing the wrong behaviors. The first thing is just think through your plan. Now, to build that behavior plan, the technology, you've got to know all of the fundamental elements. And this is like a menu that very few folks think. When you're building a behavior plan, go back and look at all of these Ds. You need to know these for the exam. Look at this like it's a cookbook. Now, we know behavior plans are not cookbook, but these are the ingredients. This is our salt and pepper and ingredients. You should know all of these Ds, how they work and what they are. And those elements then get put into the behavior change procedures, shaping and chaining and differential reinforcement, all these different components in a behavior change procedure. And a lot of times we're building something beyond a simple shaping procedure. We're going to build a system. We might build a self-management system, a token system. We have instructional systems with educational, like PSI and direct instruction. So you've got to learn C, D, E, and F and realize all of these are technologies of behavior change. Consider what the effects might be. Look how the components are used to build change procedures, and those change procedures turn into change systems. So again, this is where the task list is lining up with the 7 dimensions. Then below that, since we have now this conceptually systematic, this is where you find the rest of the FKs. Here's FK10 through FK42, and these are all the basic foundational terms and knowledges of the science of behavior. You've got to know every FK item, what it is, what it isn't, define it, recognize it, how this is affecting these elements of behavior change. This is where the science comes in. And then we get down to 43 through 46, and these are going to be the parts of verbal behavior. And so these all go into being conceptually systematic, means we have to know, identify, and explain these principles, these foundational knowledge items, FK10 all the way through 46. Now, for effectiveness, there's an article called The Right to Effective Treatment in the Job Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. And this is how we are making sure we're using those 6 things I mentioned on the first poster. And then, of course, for generality, we have another article. This was by Trevor Stokes and Don Baer. They wrote this at KU. I happened to be there when they read it, so I got to see it when it came out. And this is an implicit technology. If you're going to do generalization, they reviewed the literature to see here were 9 things we found commonly written up in articles to try to help promote generalization. They're not all going to be the tried and true, but these are the things that were used. And then you see in those articles how well they use different things like multiple exemplars, how they use different levels of practice. One of the categories in there was called train and hope. Some people did research and they simply tried to train the behaviors and they hoped they would generalize. It's not a recommended strategy, but that's what they found reported. So this article is on, here are the 9 things that were the most common procedures in our journal to date. Back to my point, this set of task list items are all the BBAs and the FKs, and this includes the rest of the items. The other piece I need to mention that is the only items, the last two FKs, 47, 48, is measurement. And this measurement points to the measurement of the home. So this is going to be used in discontinuous room time sampling. Part of my point is everything on here now represents the entire task list. And then here we are again with the CCRs, which we've already covered, but there's the G. And your challenge is to learn every single item, define it, recognize it, know how to generate an example, know what it is, know what it isn't. So when you're going to the board exam, you're going to look at the question and say, it's going to be somewhere in the 7 dimensions, or we're going to be tied to philosophy and science. In other words, this is the entire task list, what I presented. So that's where your homework is. You've got to look at the terms and definitions. As we go through these sessions over time, we'll start drilling down into different procedures and how they work and what the science is behind them. The key is you really need to know your science at a master's level in behavior analysis. So I want to go to the next poster, which is Lawfulness of Behavior. What I did here was I was talking to someone a while back, and they were not quite sure how to handle the lawfulness. So I said, well, just think of what do we know about behavior in the environment? What are some of the lawful relations? We know it's a science, it's a natural process, and we copy those natural processes of reinforcement, extinction, and punishment, and we turn them into procedures. So just build some kind of chart that helps cue you into what do we know about behavior? How does it work? What is the science behind it? I've had some folks I've helped with the exam who basically said, this exam is hard. I just need to know enough to pass the exam. And I understand the feeling, but my point is you really have to know it beyond just passing the exam. And the way to pass the exam is to simply learn the science behind it. And for the folks that hung in with me after I told them we got to go beyond just passing the test, and when you learn the science behind it, then the test actually becomes fun. It's like, I know this, I know how it works. With this question and what they told me, there's only one best answer. And that's another issue we'll talk about more in depth later, is the board exam will give you 4 options. And often 2 of those 4 are basically correct. And the challenge they tell you on the exam is pick the best answer. So the question is, well, if they're both correct, what's the best one? And that's going to be guided by things like the ethics. What is best for the client? What favors the client? What gives the client more choices? What gives the client a better long-term outcome? And the other part of what makes us best is, why is it the best? Because it's the science behind it. What is the technological? What's the science best answer? If we were talking about classical conditioning, respondent conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning, they're all the same concept, but the technical term is respondent conditioning. That's the better answer. So I want to run through this to give you a brief exercise for you to start thinking of how would you build your own poster using what you've seen and heard off the task list and your own experience to make this make sense to you. So you're analyzing questions, looking at it. Here's the procedure, here's the treatment, here's the definition. How does that work? How does that fit into the science? So my formula is, and I've seen this several places, for FK01, the lawfulness is behavior is a function of the environment. So we're talking about what people do. There's behavior we'll talk about in a minute, and there's the environment that's over here. So what I do is I start with a graph to show here's behavior. Ongoing behavior means something's reinforcement. If it's happening, it's under some kind of reinforcement schedule. There's some reinforcing properties of that behavior. And we can try a treatment, and one of 2 things happens. Either we get more behavior, so what we tried reinforced it, or you don't see the yellow line very well. It just continues, which means we tried a treatment, but the behavior didn't change. So the treatment we tried was of no real consequence. It didn't really function to change it. Whatever was maintaining before continues to maintain. The other side of that is ongoing behavior either continues on. There's a yellow line, it may be hard to see. But the point is we did something. We either stopped reinforcing it and it went down, or we started punishing it and then it went down. So behavior can basically do one of 2 things. Either maintain and increase or decrease. And that's due to the timely or random effect of consequences. So to go to the next graph, I've taken and shown the intermittent schedules of reinforcement, and here's some of the science. We know when you produce reinforcement, when behavior produces reinforcing consequences on a variable ratio schedule, when you don't know which behavior is going to pay off, like gambling, then we're going to see a very high rate of sustained responding. That's a ratio schedule, a variable ratio schedule. When behavior pays off on a fixed ratio schedule, like 5 responses, and then you get reinforced, there's a little flat spot. It's called a post-reinforcement pause. Then 5 more responses, a reinforcement, and another flat spot. So this produces what's called a break and run pattern, or sometimes referred to as a stair-step pattern. Looks like a staircase. And the ratio schedules produce higher rates of responding than the interval schedules. So what's the science behind it? Why is that a fact? Why is that a science of behavior? It's because with ratio schedules, you can increase responding and get reinforced faster. The other two schedules, which are time-based, these are temporal schedules, when you get reinforced randomly throughout time, a variable interval, we get a fairly steady, sustained rate of responding, but not near as steep as high, because responding more won't make it happen faster. An example might be a teacher in a classroom wants her students to read for 15 minutes, and she has a marble jar for the motivating reinforcers to get to, say, a movie and a pizza, and she tells them, okay, it's time for silent reading for 15 minutes. I'm going to watch you all read, and when I see you're all reading and paying attention, I'm going to put a marble in the jar. So she's watching them read for maybe 2 minutes, then she drops a marble in the jar. They hear that clink, and they kind of smile and think, oh boy, we're going to get that pizza party on Friday. Then she may wait 7 minutes and drop another one, maybe 10 minutes, then maybe 4 minutes, maybe 2 more minutes, maybe 6 minutes. But it's an intermittent schedule. It's variable, the time. They don't know when it's going to happen, so they keep reading. It sustains reading, not the fastest reading because she wants comprehension, but that schedule we know produces a very common pattern. And the fourth intermittent schedule is the fixed interval schedule, where initially there's a very low rate of responding, and then all of a sudden rapid responding, and there's the reinforcement for the first correct behavior after the end of the interval. This is why you need these definitions, and you need to understand the patterns and explain the science behind them. Why do they work? So when the reinforcer is not available, you're not going to respond initially, but as time passes, you start responding more and more, then you get reinforced and you stop. There's a post-reinforcement pause, and this makes what we call scallops, or it looks like waves. So an intermittent schedule of a fixed interval reinforcement schedule has post-reinforcement pauses, and you will see that the same post-reinforcement pauses happen with ratio. So part of what you need to know and understand is that ratio schedules produce higher rates of responding, and fixed schedules produce post-reinforcement pauses. Those are just some of the facts about the lawful relations of behavior and consequences. This bottom graph is just to demonstrate the same four schedules on the left, and this is where they put the organisms, for example, rats, pigeons, whatever, on extinction. And you'll see the pattern continues pretty much the same. There's the high rate of responding variable ratio. There's the step-like pattern, fixed ratio. There's the gradual responding the variable interval. And there's the scallop pattern. But because of the lack of reinforcement, we see the lawfulness of behaviors. Behavior that was reinforced and stops will continue a while, and then eventually will just flatten out and stop responding. This is where you have to recognize a cumulative record of behavior, which is, again, one of the tools along with our line graphs and our bar graphs. So these are just some ideas to get you thinking about what are the lawful relations of behavior, how it interacts with the environment, and when you're taking that exam, you're looking at the scenario saying, how do I explain this situation, this scenario? If there's a mom and a dad, and mom says no to the cookies and dad says yes, then we see I've got an SD and an S delta. Dad's the SD for asking for cookies, mom's the S delta. Okay, how does that work? Well, he waits till mom leaves, then he asks dad. So you go, okay, that's a little bit of scheduling. He's going to ask dad when he can, because dad's more likely to give him a cookie. So we want to know the lawful relations. In any scenario you read, you're trying to say, what's the science behind it? With that said, the next column, and these are just some quick examples, FK10 gives us three concepts: behavior, response, response class. And this is where you've got to look it up and realize behavior has three dimensions. It has repeatability, it has temporal extent, and temporal locus. You've got to know those terms. Repeatability means it happens repeatedly. As soon as it occurs, it's behavior. The temporal extent is the time it lasts, the duration, how long it happens. And the temporal locus is when it happens in time. So as soon as a response occurs, it's happening. It happens for some amount of time, maybe half a second, maybe 20 minutes, and it happens at some point in time. That qualifies as behavior and interaction with the environment. Also realize that there are two kinds of behavior. There can be private behavior and public behavior. As far as measurement, public behavior and private behavior. Covert, like thinking, we're not going to see. Overt is what we do with methodological behaviors. Overt is what we can see and measure. That's what we're going to work with, is the overt behavior. But we might tell a child to think about it and then answer, and we don't actually know or see what he's thinking, but he has a history of thinking, and when he does actually respond, we're going to measure his response. So responses are defined as as individual instances of behavior, and then we're going to get the response class as all of those individual responses that serve the behavior to meet the behavior definition, and this makes up that repertoire. So in this case, if you're teaching getting dressed behavior, you have a number of responses: put on a sock, put on a sock, put on underwear, put on pants, put on a shirt, put on a belt, put on shoes. All of those responses make up the response class of getting dressed. That adds to the client's repertoire. Now you're dressed, it functions, now I can go outside and play. Now I'm dressed, I can go to the movie, I can go to the store. So we've got to know every term and every category on the task list and understand how they work as behavior. The next one, of course, says now the same thing as since behavior is a function of the environment, you've got to know, understand, and explain that there are two environments. There are public and private environments. So the public environments, we can see behavior. That's part of our methodological behaviorism. We can see where it happens. We can see what are the environmental stimuli, which is defined as an energy change that affects our sensory receptors: light, sound, movement, vibration, any of the things that stimulate our bodies. That's a stimulus, plural of stimuli. And if we take the getting dressed example, a stimulus class is all those stimuli that you respond to that make up the response class. So if I'm talking about getting dressed, the responses is all the behaviors that involve putting on wearable items. And the stimulus class then, the socks, underwear, pants, shoes, and belt, that's the stimulus class of wearable items. So we've got to take these categories of response classes made of responses and how those function to be the same. Reading, writing gives you information. Food preparation gives you something to eat. Stimulus class are the things that interact within that category. So all the things I use to make food make up the stimulus class of cooking, food preparation. If I'm teaching a child to set the table, then the stimulus class of table setting behavior, the responses it takes to set the table, are in response to the stimuli: knife, fork, plate, spoon, bowl, cup, napkin, that make up the stimulus class. So we can learn to recognize these behaviors as response classes and stimulus classes, and understand response classes serve the same basic function. And a number of responses can serve the function. They're not all going to look the same. The topography will be different. My point is that you're studying that task list where you need to be and develop your fluency is to know the items and definitions, know examples, and then work your way through the task list saying there's an example of this, there's an example. Here's a quick one for stimulus equivalence. We can't teach every stimulus that has the same meaning. So if we take a picture of a dog and we say to the child, find this other picture that looks like this one. We often start with the picture of a dog, and the other side that has pictures of a dog, a horse, a cat, and a cow. And the child then matches the sample. This is the dog. This picture is the same. So that's A equals A. It's the same thing. Then we say now this, and we write out the word DOG, and we say this is the spelling for that picture. So now the child learns, he sees the picture of the dog, and he looks over here and he sees DOG, CAT, COW, and he matches that the DOG is the same basic stimulus concept as the picture of the dog. So the picture of the dog and the DOG have equivalent. They're equivalent as far as that concept, because stimuli are making up concepts. Then we teach the child that this letters DOG makes this sound. This sound is dog. So they learn to read. They learn the letters. Learn letters are different from numbers. They learn the sound the letters make. Then they say the sounds by saying the sounds of those letters, and they get to dog, and they say dog. So now they learn that the sound dog, the letters DOG, and the picture all have the same equivalents. They're all the same basic concept. And this is where one of the sort of the magic of this is you teach two of those three. This is the picture, this is the spelled word. You teach this is a spelled word, this is a sound, and the child then gets this free, untaught, transitive relationship that, oh, well, if this is the picture and that's what the word looks like and sounds like, then this sound dog is the name of this picture. And this is how we teach stimulus equivalent. And this accounts for so much learning. It's just phenomenal. This just shows a few examples. They've taken this on to 9, 27, 54, 128 relationships. This is an incredible phenomenon, how we learn to discriminate. All these stimuli realize that's in the same class. If I'm talking dog, the picture, the spelling, and the sound are all in the stimulus class for the concept of dog. And these are the three levels we see about the A is A. If I teach A as B, that means B is also A. If I teach B as C, C is also B. And then they figure out the free untaught one is that, oh, A then is the same as C. And now here's the other big piece. We have two categories in behavior analysis. We work with respondent behaviors and operant behaviors. So to understand those, we have to first know what are the reflexive relations. And this is where we have trouble sometimes because we've been taught to use psychological labels for emotions. And basically, emotions are fine, but what they are is they are reflexive behaviors. And this is a very simple science, not that it's not complex, but the physiology of behavior is an unconditioned stimulus elicits an unconditioned response. These two make the concept of reflex. And what I've got here is cold air gives me goosebumps. It's a reflex. Hot air makes me sweat. A loud noise will elicit a startle response. Now, our startle response needs to be defined as more of a behavior that's physiological. So we would say a loud noise will set off basically the startle, and what that is going to be increased heart rate or tightened chest muscles, maybe a dryness and tightening of the throat, maybe the face flushes. So there are a lot of natural stimuli, unconditioned, that will naturally set off physiological responses. Those are called reflexes. Reflexive relations are the respondent behaviors. Those behaviors are what we feel. Those are feelings. Psychology will give them labels like frightened, scared, happy, sad. Those aren't behaviors, they're psychological labels for emotional states. We treat those as respondent behaviors. So when we hear about an emotional state, we realize something set that off in the environment, because behaviors that function in the environment. In this exam scenario, what in this story is likely to set off some kind of reflex? And because we know about conditioning, and we know a lot about conditioning, we know that if a neutral stimulus is present and an unconditioned stimulus occurs, and elicits the unconditioned response, that neutral stimulus turns into a conditioned stimulus, sets off that same basic response, only now it's conditioned. So we have unconditioned reflexes and we have conditioned reflexes. The difference is that respondents are elicited. This is key. Elicited goes with respondent in our field. These are involuntary behaviors. A child that's sleeping at night and something falls over in the closet, makes a noise, it startles him, he wakes up, his heart's pounding, his chest is tight, he cries, the parents run in, they say, what happened? He says, I'm scared, I'm frightened. He's learned to identify that feeling. The parent tells the parents there's a monster in the closet. And the parents open the closet, turn the lights on, and say, oh, look, a box fell over, there's no monster in the closet. It's okay, calm down, relax, a little hug, maybe a kiss, and say, okay, it's okay, there's no monster, you're fine, calm down. His heart rate slows down, he calms down, he falls asleep. Now, the next night, the parents say, okay, good night, sweetheart, put him to bed and turn the light off, and all of a sudden, his heart speeds up. Well, the darkness got paired with the noise, and now the darkness has become a conditioned stimulus. This is how we learn our fear of the dark, and the fear is the label for feeling our heart rate or the chest muscles. This we understand very well as behavioral scientists and as respondent conditioning, and we know how to use desensitization, progressive relaxation. We know how to use different techniques to help people calm themselves when they're feeling these natural body reflexes, these physiological responses. Often in psychology, I was told that these feelings cause behaviors. And we would say, we're not going to explain it that way, because these feelings are behaviors. These are reflexive physiological behaviors. What happens is when you're feeling something, you do behave. But this first, the actual behavior is a reflex. So we've learned with operant conditioning, and these are behaviors that are learned, these are emitted, they're evoked, they are voluntary behaviors. They are basically, this is what we've learned to do. And there are, let's say, they're volitional. And we typically talk about the ABCs. And I learned these as SRS, because the antecedent stimulus occurs, it evokes behavior, that's a response, and then my response and behavior changes the environment, so the stimulus environment is changed. So we do look at the antecedent for the trigger, look at the behavior, how did the behavior change the environment, what's the consequence, how did that function to reinforce or make more behavior or punish behavior. So we understand how operant conditioning works, and what happens is when we look our whole field together, we're always feeling something, hungry, tired, scared, bored, something. And what we're feeling respondently interacts with what we've learned to do on a continuum. So we get a genuine reflex as a cause effect. Cold air will give you goosebumps. What we've learned to do operantly is when you're cold, you put on a sweater. And now the consequence of that is you're not cold anymore. You could call that negative reinforcement. Or if you're cold and you put on a sweater and now you're warmer, we'd say, I've escaped from the cold, negative reinforcement. Or positive reinforcement, because now I'm warmer. And that gets confusing. Well, if you're cold and you put on a sweater, is that positive or negative reinforcement? Well, actually, it's both. You are escaping from the cold, you're terminating the cold, you're also getting warm. So when you watch these scenarios and the exams, you've got to watch to see how did they state the question. If I was cold, put it on, I'm not cold anymore, I've escaped from the cold, negative reinforcement. If I was cold, I put on a sweater, and now I'm warm, I've added warmth, positive reinforcement. Basically, it's both. Most life behaviors are operantly reinforced by positive and negative reinforcements. So watch for the wording, because this is one of these academic exercises, realizing that Whatever we're feeling affects things we do, doesn't cause it, because these operants are learned. What caused is that stimuli that sets off the behavior. It may have been a conditioned stimuli or an unconditioned, and what we've learned to do about it is our operant behavior. So these are just some quick examples of lawful relations of behavior. As you study and prep the exam, you're going to look at every practice question you can get. We're going to talk about cases, do case conceptualization. You're going to share stories of what you tried that worked and what didn't work. We're going to analyze it. We're going to talk about how could you change the antecedent environment to evoke more behavior? How could you change the MOs to make the behavior more likely to occur? How do we satiate behavior to slow it down? How do we deprive reinforcement to get more motivation? How do we use this knowledge? This last column, again, is just some more graphs to show there's behavior occurring, something happens that's reinforced, or behavior is occurring and doesn't get reinforced, another graphic explanation. I tried to make an ABC chart for operants and respondents. I've never seen one before. So I put the stimulus function, but for the respondents, I put the unconditioned stimulus, elicits the unconditioned response, and there is no consequence. It's just unconditioned. Now, the neutral stimulus gets paired, and that sets off the conditioned response, but again, the consequences aren't affecting respondents because they're reflexes, but it is a conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus. Then the bottom half is more familiar because the antecedents are MOs and SDs, S deltas and SPs, so you've got to make sure you understand the difference between SDs, S deltas, SPs. They're all basically, SDs, S deltas, they're all three basically discriminate stimuli. If you're teaching red, and you have red and you have green, at that time, the child discriminates. If I touch red, I'm likely to be reinforced. If I touch green, I'm not likely to be reinforced. So they are discriminating not to touch green, but we call it an S delta. And an SP is going to signal the possibility of punishment. And there's the behavior, the response and response classes to these stimuli, to the motivating operations. And then something is either added or removed, which makes it positive or negative reinforcement, or positive or negative punishment, depending on how the behaviors function, making more or less. Here's a quick graph of matching law. The matching law basically says you're going to match your effort to what's the most enticing. So as behavior flows for the reinforcement goes. So you're going to typically use the least amount of effort the biggest payoff. The more behavior you see happening, that means that's got a pretty big payoff. And finally, in the bottom, you're going to see a typical treatment curve. And this is an example of a baseline at a high rate of behavior. We decided to put an extinction. You see that little temporary extinction burst. We know that's going to be the cessation of reinforcement. For previous reinforced behavior produces a burst. Then you see this dramatic novelty effect where the behavior drops off after the burst. Then it pops back up. Then it drops down again. And it sort of continues intermittently at a low rate. This is why I say we don't get rid of a behavior 100%. A behavior can pretty much drop out, but it's still in the repertoire. I want to draw attention to this little bump here. We call this spontaneous recovery. Other fields call this a rebound effect. In physics, it's called resurgence. So it's the same basic phenomena about physics, chemistry, biology, and behavior, but in our field, we tend to use the word, sometimes we use resurgence, rebound, or spontaneous recovery, but I think you're going to see spontaneous recovery most commonly used in our literature in our field. Okay, now the next thing I want to cover, and this is my last poster, is I've suggested an exercise where you take the task list items and you basically make a chart. I've got it here on a single page, although I couldn't fit it all on one page. And I was just taking the task list trying to see where do these items go. So I named my chart FK9 Conceptual Analysis of Behavior, because basically we're analyzing and talking about the concepts. And then I took and I looked at here antecedent events like life, and I put FK, it's FK11, I've got a typo, where I'm talking about environmental stimuli that occur before behavior. Something changed, it was either added or removed. Well, I've got add or remove as a person, place, or thing, and that set off behaviors. Some of these up here are the reflexive relations are antecedents like cold air, which would set off this response, this reflex. And so respondent conditioning is going to be part of the antecedent, although it does go into the behavior column. And the pairing happens with the antecedent of neutral, and the understems get paired. I made that kind of gray to make it a respondent. I put these kind of grade to make them respondents, and I put over here no effect on responding because they're respondents. But the other terms are obvious. There's the FK15 is operant conditioning. We have discriminating stimuli. There are multiple functions of a single stimulus. That's FK25. There's the SD signals reinforcement. The S delta signals extinction. The SP signals likely punishment. There's FK12, the stimulus equivalence, reflexivity, symmetry, tensivity. FK34 I put over here because we have simple discriminations. We have conditional discriminations. We have to know and understand what's meant by conditional discriminations. We've got stimulus discrimination, simple and conditional. We've got stimulus generalization. We've got motivating operations or antecedents, and there are 9 basic MOs. These are usually referred to as the UMOs. They're unconditioned, they're natural. And then we have our 3 CMOs, which alter the reinforcing value, either establish a reinforcer as more powerful or abolish it as less powerful. It alters behavior, either evokes behavior, more behavior, or it abates behavior. And then we have our reflexive, our CMO R, CMOS, CMOT. So these are all antecedent concepts, and as you learn them and how they work and how they affect behavior, and you see them on the exam, you're going to realize they're talking about a CMO. They're talking about a UMO. They're talking about SDs and S deltas. They're talking about some operant behavior being set off. This just helps you know, how do I categorize these terms? In the behavior column, FK10 behaviors, there's behavior occurs, that's repeatability. There's temporal extent, that's the duration. There's temporal extent, that's location where it happens in time. Here's the FK01, lawfulness of behavior, behavior responses, response classes. Here's the measures of behavior. Here's continuous measures, discontinuous measures. You need to know these terms. Here's the time sampling measures. We need to know how all of these work, the strengths and weaknesses of them. The artifacts of measurement. What are some of the side effects of your measurement model? The third column for consequences, I put FK23 because that's the category. And there's, again, environmental changes. The same FK11 is here. There's where something was added or removed after behavior. There's operant conditioning. There's reinforcement. There's non-contingent reinforcement. There's continuous reinforcement. There's intermittent reinforcement. There's my schedules. There's response generalization. There's behavioral contrast, behavioral momentum, matching law. Punishment is a consequence of behavior, function to make more or less behavior. So over here is the functions, which is going to be FK33 functional relations. So there's positive reinforcement. You can add something. There's automatic reinforcement. There's negative reinforcement. Positive punishment is a function. Negative punishment is a function. So I tried taking all of these, and I had this one simple page, and I basically first built this little graph. I ran out of room because all my experimental conditions should also be under function, because that's where I'm looking for the function of the experimental design. So this is an older model. I haven't updated it. Down here, it just says 2 basic functions. So I look at, since behavior is occurring, it's either positive or negative reinforcement. Could be social, a parent or a peer. Could be getting access to a person, place, or thing. So that just breaks it down. My point is, this is the idea of find a strategy that works for you, look at the whole thing and figure out how would you map it out? How would you make sense of behavior? How would you build some map to cover the concepts, the philosophy, the ABCs? How would you build some kind of map on that? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back and stop sharing my screen. By the way, I have 8 of those posters, but I didn't want to completely overwhelm you tonight. So now what I want to do is, besides suggest that if you haven't tried to make an ABC chart just for yourself to figure how does this work, I want to take a moment and try this. What I've got here is this. Well, behind me I have an easel. I've already talked about these basic posters. So I'm going to pull those down for a moment. Don't be frightened. The reason I say don't be frightened is if you just happen to accidentally catch this, there's a picture back here that's on the scene. This doesn't belong in the thing, but this is what happened last November. I was trying to get that job at the mall, but some fat guy beat me out, so I got a shaven haircut. Okay, now here's what I want to do with this. I'm suggesting that you use this for exam prep strategies. I try to cover a lot of areas to consider. How do you build the best tool that you've got? Then when we meet weekly, I'm going to have you ask about terms and concepts. I'll make a list of the things you want to talk about off the task list, procedures, cases, and we're going to take those and go through them and talk about them and how to put them into the ABCs, talk about how do they work and why do they work. So I'm suggesting a model where you figure out, and this is brand new for me, is to, I'm just trying to find some way to use these terms, these letters, etc. And how would you map it out? For example, if I said, okay, and usually we do the acronyms in order, but this is freestyle. So if I say, okay, what I want to talk first about is the philosophy. So I'm going to talk about the philosophies, and I'm going to look at the philosophies of science. So I'm going to have here my determinism, empiricism, parsimony, pragmatism. I'm going to have my environmental versus my mental. I'm going to have my philosophical concepts here. Then over here, I'm going to know this is my science and how it works. I know that I've got antecedents, so I'm going to go over here and make this my antecedent column. And under my antecedents, I'm going to sneak my MOs down here from modeling operations. I know there are UMOs and CMOs, and that these antecedents. There's the MOs, then there's also the SDs, the S deltas, the SPs, and these are all antecedents. And antecedents are behavior altering stimuli. So how do I have examples of how these alter behavior? So that means I need to have behavior. And since it's a single subject world, I'm going to put the I down here in my behavior column for the individual and see how does an antecedent affect this behavior. So if I get this response to this behavior, then of course the consequence of it would be positive reinforcement. So I'm going to add something. And if I respond to this with the same response, I get nothing. So that would be extinction. And try to build an ABC chart and try to think of examples. Or as SP, if I respond to this with a behavior, how does that end up punishing behavior? If the consequence is added or removed, same with here, added or removed, how would that then function to make more or less behavior? So I can start to take any behavioral concept. I've got my philosophy, I've got my antecedents, my behaviors. In my behaviors, I have my measurement. How am I measuring and defining it? How are the consequences? How are the schedules of reinforcement or punishment affecting it? How's it functioning? And here then I might say, okay, now to change behavior, I'll make T into treatment. So what are my treatments? And that's all my different behavior change procedures. This is going to be my shaping and chaining, and how come I use forward chaining for one behavior and backward chaining for another? What's the science behind that? If the story tells my client doesn't have a lot of information, I'm not going to get very far in a forward chain. I've got to get him all the way to the last step and have him just do the last behavior, because that's going to put him in contact with the reinforcement. And it's all about getting the client to reinforcement to strengthen behavior. So I'm going to use whatever treatment models let me engineer the environment to evoke the behaviors that I need that are operant and get them to happen so I can reinforce them. So by reinforcing this behavior here and not here, this becomes an SD. How do you get an SD? Discrimination training. What do? I need 2 or more stimuli before I can discriminate. And once I get the SD reinforced in this reinforcement history, then I can develop what we call stimulus control, where now he's more likely to respond here because of the reinforcement history. Now, if he's hungry, which means food deprived, you're motivated because food has more value because you're hungry. And so we don't eat because we're hungry, we eat because we're food deprived. We don't eat every time we're hungry. But the MO is I haven't eaten food, so I'm motivated. The SD is the refrigerator. It's the kitchen, it's the cabinet, it's the grocery store, it's the fast food. There's the SD. I respond to that SD. So in storage, you're looking to read, is this a motivating operation? A Mike was out running on a hot summer day. Okay, there's the behavior. This is ongoing. He's probably going to be tired and thirsty and hot. So I'm looking to see, what did he do then? He then went in the house and got a drink. So there, water had reinforcing value because he was hot and thirsty, and he cooled off. So, but the SD was he had to respond to the SD. Sometimes he goes by the sink and doesn't get a drink. Well, he wasn't motivated. So why did you do it now and not then? And you can see, it's a question about motivating operations. Is it about what stimulus you went to? So I get stimulus control. Is it about how did that behavior then? Now that I was thirsty and I drank, so that established water is more of a reinforcer. But the more water I drank, it then abolished water because now I'm satiated. So I did water seeking, water drinking, but I've stopped the behavior now. The consequence functions because I'm full. So these stimuli are function altering because the consequences make more or less behavior. So you learn how to take behavior altering, evokes behavior, MOs and SDs. Consequences then alter the function, make more or less behavior. And then when you use something like differential reinforcement, you're doing repertoire building. It's repertoire altering. When you stop reinforcing the problem behavior and teach a new behavior, you've increased the repertoire. So then I get to the point I have to say, okay, so there's my trying to make a map of how would I take and explain behavior analysis, so I can take any example on a quiz, question, or practice test and start finding it and explain how the behavior works as a science of behavior. How would I then explain it? So that's one exercise. I'm encouraging you to find some way to build whatever makes sense to you. So you've got a go-to, and you flesh it out as you go. I started with one poster. I have 8. I have what I call the wall of behaviors, like 8 posters that I use for some of these lectures. Now, I'm going to do something I rarely do, but I need to do it. I'm going to stop talking for a moment.